I've always been a big believer in experimentation and coming up with new ideas for different things, and I thought I've come up with an idea here which I haven't seen before, and I thought I might share with you guys because I think it might be useful for people who are trying to actually make up castings and that sort of stuff. The first thing is, I've never been a big believer in wasting materials, so when you have the stuff that's left over in the bowl and it sets inside the bowl, I've been keeping this stuff aside because I had it in my head that I might be able to do something with it. And what I've gone back to is an old idea that I had with the leftover shavings and dust that actually came off the resin pieces when they're actually cut and shaved down, to be mixed with the resin and reused as a filler for the large areas that actually needed it. And I wasn't really sure whether or not it would work with this stuff. So I did a bit of experimentation on a small scale, and then found that it actually worked so well that I've actually started moving it over to the large pieces. And I'll just show you what I mean. When you have pieces like this that are unusually shaped, generally what you'll do is you'll actually fill them in, like I've started doing on this side here. You'll fill them in with the silicone, and then you'll actually create a plaster mother mold that will actually go around it. But the problem that I found, because of the complexity of some of these shapes, is even an area like this still has quite a large undercut area in there, which means if I was to fill that up with a plaster piece, it's not going to want to come out. And what I've had to do is actually backfill that area with a higher degree of silicone so that it creates a smooth enough area that a mother mold can pop off. So I've gone back to the old idea of recycling the material, and because the silicone sticks to the silicone really well, what I've found is that I've been able to actually take the wastage stuff that I've got and just a pair of scissors and actually start sort of mulling that up into really small pieces. And then when I actually have enough of it, I can actually mix it into a compound that blends together. And because it is a structural piece, things like bubbles and that sort of stuff aren't that much of an issue. But as you can see there, if I can get in quite close, there's very, very little in the way of any bubble issues anyway. The other thing that I'm doing with this is that I'm leaving this at about halfway through the pot life. So the first part of the pot life provides the coating I need, and then as the catalyst reaction starts, I use what would be waste material, mix it with the other what would be waste material to produce this blocking material that I can then actually use to actually pack around. An example of that is where I'm working on one of the leg pieces, you can see there, okay, where I've sort of backfilled that area, and that again will just provide much more structural strength. So now when I do actually put a piece of plaster over that so that I can take the flexing sort of factor out of it, it means that the internal structure has got a lot more strength and is far less likely to collapse and cause distortions within the mould. So the other thing I've worked out is with the seaming of the moulds. Now this one has actually had the piece taken out of it, that's the piece that's come out of it, and to actually get that out of the mould successfully, I had to sort of cut it in this sort of open sort of clam sort of fashion, and I've had to work the seams out as I've gone along. Now that's not a big deal, but it does make for a pretty messy sort of seaming system in terms of joining that back together. And more to the point, how do I close that up in such a way that I'm not going to have any leakage issues, because the resin itself is very thin when it's mixed. What I've come up with, and I've tried this a couple of times now and it's worked really well, is again, as the resin's getting close to the end of its pot life, where that seam has been cut down here, okay, and the piece has been removed, I've just held that piece back together so the seams are nice and tightly closed, and smeared more silicone over the top of it to close over the top of that seam. So now I can fill that from the top, and if I stretch that, there you go, you can see where that seam is there. And that again, that's not going to matter, because it holds itself closed quite nicely, and because it's an open top mold, I don't have any issues with that. But it means that this side issue where I would have had leakage is completely sealed up and I don't have any issues with it. Now, it's not particularly pretty, but then all I've got to do is slice that open to remove the piece, and I can do that as many times as I need to. Each time it's actually making a thicker seam that's progressively easier to actually close and join up again. I know a lot of mold makers might take a look at this and go, oh my god, what the hell is he doing? But it's a technique that I've found works really quickly. It keeps the internal seams on the inside very, very clean. There's no bleeding of the silicone back into the centre of the mould, because it's only covered on the outside edge, and it just means that there's absolutely no chance that any of the liquid can actually leak out through those seams when the resin is poured in. So anyway, that's just a little trick that I've come up with that I've used a couple of times now to produce some of the pieces, and it seems to be working really well. There's another one that's slightly more complicated where it's actually been seamed on both sides. Again, it's not a pretty mould, but from the point of view of what it's producing in terms of the parts coming out of it, they're coming out of it nice and clean. I'm not losing any resin to leakage in the process. So yeah, it seems to be working really well. So hopefully that's a tip that somebody can make use of. The other idea that I've come up with this particleized recycled stuff that I'm using is I've been able to thicken this section up. That actually has a thin section that runs down the centre there, and I wanted good structure around the outside of it to take away from any chance of it actually warping. And the way I've been able to do that is by laying out a piece of Glad wrap on the table, centering it to the Glad wrap like that, putting a good blob of the stuff on either side, and then folding it up and over the sides, and then squashing it all sort of down, and then binding it and wrapping it up into the Glad wrap so that it starts to squash out into all those sort of nooks and crannies. And again, the blue that you can see there is just the edges. You can see here where that needs to be a little bit backfilled. I'm not wasting large amounts of the silicone by packing in areas where I don't particularly need to. All I'm doing is actually taking the rubbish sort of material, and as the pot life starts to run out, I just grab a handful of the chopped up stuff, add it to it, mix it up, and use that as packing material to actually go around all the different types of pieces that actually need that extra volume. It saved me a great amount of materials when it comes to the actual silicone. It'll also mean that for some of these other parts that may have needed a mother mould, I'll be able to do away with the need for that mould at all, and I'll just be able to actually support them sort of like that, and then pour directly into the top of that, and that'll work fine. It won't require an outside plaster piece to actually hold the structure of it. So I hope there's a couple of tips in there that you guys found useful. That's pretty much the update for this time. Talk to you next time.